That wreath stays where it is, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres said, his voice cutting through the morning silence like steel. The maintenance worker's ladder swayed as he reached for the memorial wreath, tools clattering to the marble steps. To the early visitors, it was just groundskeeping, routine maintenance at the Lincoln Memorial. To Torres, it was a line that couldn't be crossed, not for landscaping schedules, not for photo opportunities. What the worker didn't know, what the gathering crowd couldn't see, was that the wreath bore the name of Torres's fallen brother-in-arms, placed there by a Gold Star mother who'd traveled 1,000 miles to honor her son. But the real surprise was coming, and it wore the oak leaves of a colonel who'd received Torres's urgent call just minutes earlier. Welcome to True Story Zone. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. If these stories speak to you, hit that subscribe button to support the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. At 6:30 a.m., the Lincoln Memorial stood in quiet majesty, its marble columns catching the first rays of dawn. Among the scattered early visitors and joggers, one figure commanded attention without seeking it. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, 29 years old, moved with the measured precision that marked him as one of Arlington's elite, a sentinel of the tomb of the unknown soldier. Torres stood 6 feet tall with a lean, athletic build honed by years of military service. His dark hair was cropped in a perfect military fade, and his brown eyes held the steady gaze of someone who'd seen both honor and loss. Even in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray polo, and polished black boots, he carried himself with the bearing of a soldier. Today was his day off, but duty called him here for a different kind of watch. The morning air was crisp with autumn's promise, and Torres breathed deeply as he climbed the memorial's steps. In his left hand, he carried a simple manila envelope, and in his right, a small digital camera. His mission today was personal, documenting the memorial wreath that had been placed yesterday by Elena Rodriguez, the Gold Star mother whose son had died in Torres's arms 3 months ago in Afghanistan. Private First Class Carlos Rodriguez had been more than just another soldier in Torres's unit. At 22, Carlos was the joker, the heart, the one who could make even the grimmest moments bearable with his infectious laugh and unwavering optimism. Carlos had saved Torres's life during their final mission together, pushing him clear of an IED blast that should have killed them both. Instead, it killed Carlos and left Torres with a promise he couldn't break. "Take care of my mama, Sergeant. Make sure she knows I died proud." Yesterday, Elena Rodriguez had traveled from San Antonio to Washington, D.C., carrying a wreath of white roses and blue ribbons. She'd asked Torres to meet her at the Lincoln Memorial. Not Arlington, she'd explained, because Lincoln represented the promise that no sacrifice would be forgotten. Together, they'd placed the wreath at the base of the memorial, and Elena had whispered her son's name to the marble walls. He loved coming here on school trips, she'd told Torres, her weathered hands smoothing the ribbon. He said Lincoln understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Torres had promised to check on the wreath, to make sure it stayed in place for the 3 days Elena would remain in the city. It was a small promise, but after losing Carlos, Torres had learned that the smallest promises often mattered most. Kevin Brennan arrived at the Lincoln Memorial at 7 a.m. sharp, his Park Service truck loaded with maintenance equipment and a checklist that left no room for sentiment. At 45, Brennan had been managing grounds maintenance for the National Mall for 8 years, and his reputation was built on efficiency and strict adherence to regulations. Brennan was a stocky man of average height with graying brown hair and pale blue eyes that rarely showed emotion. He wore the standard Park Service uniform, green shirt, khaki pants, and work boots that had seen thousands of miles of walking across memorials and monuments. His approach to the job was methodical: arrive early, follow protocol, complete tasks without deviation. The memorial wreath at Lincoln's base immediately caught his attention, and he consulted his tablet with growing irritation.
According to park regulations, unauthorized memorial items could remain in place for 24 hours before removal. The wreath had been there for 18 hours, close enough to the limit to justify action, especially with a high-profile diplomatic visit scheduled for later that morning.
Brennan set up his ladder without hesitation, his movements efficient and practiced. He'd removed hundreds of unauthorized memorial items over the years: flowers left by tourists, flags placed by veterans groups, personal mementos that violated park guidelines. To him, the wreath was just another item to be processed and disposed of according to regulation. He climbed the ladder, reaching for the wreath's blue ribbon, when a voice stopped him cold. "That wreath stays where it is." Torres had been photographing the memorial from different angles when he saw Brennan approach with his ladder. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system, not the combat alertness he'd known in Afghanistan, but something deeper, more personal. This was about keeping faith with Elena Rodriguez, about honoring Carlos's memory, about maintaining the dignity that small gestures of remembrance deserved. Brennan looked down from his perch on the ladder, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Sir, I'm Parks Service Maintenance. This wreath violates federal regulations regarding unauthorized memorial displays. It needs to be removed." Torres moved closer, his civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish the authority in his posture. "That wreath was placed by a Gold Star mother whose son died serving this country. It represents her sacrifice in his service." "I understand the sentiment," Brennan replied, his tone becoming more bureaucratic, "but sentiment doesn't override federal law. Section 7.96 of the Code of Federal Regulations clearly states that unauthorized items placed on federal monuments must be removed within 24 hours. "It's been less than 24 hours, Torres said, checking his watch. "And more importantly, that wreath deserves the respect due to any memorial honoring military sacrifice." Brennan's jaw tightened. He'd dealt with protesters, activists, and emotional family members before, and his response was always the same: follow the rules, maintain order, avoid complications. "Sir, I have a job to do. This wreath will be removed, cataloged, and disposed of according to proper procedures." Torres stepped closer to the base of the ladder, his brown eyes meeting Brennan's pale blue ones with unwavering intensity. "The wreath stays in place. Find another way to do your job." The small crowd of early morning visitors began to take notice of the confrontation. A jogger slowed to watch, removing her earbuds. An elderly man walking his dog paused near the memorial steps. A young couple taking selfies lowered their phones, sensing tension in the air. Brennan felt the weight of attention and doubled down on protocol. "Sir, if you interfere with Park Service operations, I'll have to call security. This is federal property and federal regulations apply." Torres didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but his presence seemed to fill the space around the memorial. "Before you make that call, let me tell you about Private First Class Carlos Rodriguez, 22 years old, from San Antonio. He died saving a squad from an IED in Afghanistan 3 months ago. Yesterday, his mother traveled 1,000 miles to place that wreath in his memory." The words hung in the morning air, and the gathered visitors drew closer, forming a small semicircle around the memorial steps. Brennan felt their attention like a spotlight, but he'd been trained to resist emotional appeals. "I respect the soldier's service and his family's loss," Brennan said, his voice slightly less certain, "but individual exceptions lead to chaos. If I allow this wreath, I'll have to allow every memorial item anyone wants to place here." Torres reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. Carlos in his dress uniform, grinning at the camera with the infectious smile that had lit up their forward operating base. "This is Carlos. He saved my life. His mother asked me to make sure his memory was treated with dignity. I gave her my word." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. The elderly man with the dog stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. "My son served in Vietnam. I know what it means to lose a child to war. That wreath should stay." The jogger nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "My brother's in the Marines. I can't imagine losing him. Please, just leave it alone." Brennan looked around at the faces surrounding him, feeling the weight of their expectations and the pressure of his obligations. "I understand everyone's feelings, but I have specific orders. The diplomatic visit this morning requires the memorial to be in pristine condition according to federal standards." Torres' expression hardened. "Pristine condition? A Gold Star mother's wreath somehow makes this memorial less pristine?" The tension escalated as Brennan reached again for the wreath, determined to complete his assigned task despite the growing opposition. "Sir, step away from the ladder. I'm removing this item now." Torres placed his hand on the ladder's base, not aggressively, but with unmistakable intent. "No, you're not." The confrontation had drawn more than a dozen observers, and word was spreading through social media. The young couple had begun live streaming the incident, their phones capturing every word of the exchange. A small group of tourists from the nearby metro station had joined the crowd, drawn by the obvious tension and the sight of a uniformed Park Service worker facing off against a determined young man. Brennan felt the situation slipping beyond his control, but protocol demanded he complete his assigned task. "Sir, for the final time, I'm ordering you to step away from this ladder. Interference with federal operations is a criminal offense." Torres didn't budge. "And disrespecting military sacrifice is a moral offense. Which one matters more?" The crowd murmured approval, and several people began taking photos and videos. Brennan realized that this was no longer just about removing a wreath. It was becoming a public relations incident that could reflect poorly on the Park Service and, by extension, on him personally. "Look," Brennan said, his tone softening slightly as he tried a different approach. "I can arrange for the wreath to be moved to a more appropriate location. There are designated areas for memorial displays that don't violate federal guidelines." Torres shook his head firmly. Elena Rodriguez didn't travel 1,000 miles to place her son's memorial in a designated area. She chose this spot because it meant something to Carlos, because he understood what Lincoln represented: sacrifice for principles bigger than ourselves. The elderly man with the dog spoke up again, his voice carrying the authority of years and experience. "Son," he said to Brennan, "I've been coming to this memorial for 30 years. I've seen thousands of flowers, flags, and wreaths placed here by people who needed to honor their loved ones. The memorial isn't diminished by their grief. It's enhanced by it." A middle-aged woman in business attire, apparently heading to work, stopped and joined the conversation. "My father fought in Korea. He's buried at Arlington. When I visit his grave, I see families leaving mementos, flowers, personal items. The guards don't remove them. They protect them. Why is this different?" Brennan found himself defending a position that felt increasingly uncomfortable. Arlington is a cemetery with different regulations. This is a national monument with specific preservation requirements. Torres pulled out his phone and held it up. "Should I call Colonel Patricia Hayes at Arlington? She oversees Old Guard operations. I'm sure she'd be interested in discussing the appropriate treatment of military memorials." The mention of a colonel and the Old Guard sent a visible ripple through Brennan's composure. He'd heard of the Old Guard, the elite unit that conducted military funerals at Arlington and provided ceremonial support for the nation's most important events. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the military's most disciplined and respected representatives. "Your Old Guard?" Brennan asked, his tone shifting noticeably. Torres nodded. "Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Tomb Guard. I've stood watch at the tomb of the unknown soldier for 3 years. I understand the importance of precision, protocol, and respect for military tradition." The crowd's attention intensified. Several people whispered, "Tomb Guard," with obvious reverence. The live-streaming couple explained to their viewers that Tomb Guards were among the most elite soldiers in the U.S. military, selected for their dedication and precision in honoring fallen service members. Brennan felt the ground shifting beneath him. Opposing a random civilian was one thing. Opposing a Tomb Guard was entirely different. But he still had his orders, and the diplomatic visit was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. "Sergeant Torres," Brennan said, trying to strike a balance between respect and authority, "I acknowledge your service and your commitment to honoring fallen soldiers, but I have specific instructions for preparing this memorial for a diplomatic visit. The wreath must be removed." Torres's response was immediate and unwavering. "Then you'll have to remove me first." The standoff had reached an impasse, and Brennan realized he needed support. He called his supervisor, Park Service District Manager Janet Williams, explaining the situation in clipped, professional terms. "We have a Tomb Guard refusing to allow removal of an unauthorized memorial wreath. He's claiming it represents military sacrifice and shouldn't be disturbed." Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Park Service with experience managing sensitive situations, immediately understood the complexity of the problem. "You said he's a Tomb Guard from Arlington?" "That's what he claims. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres." Williams was quiet for a moment. "Kevin, stand down. Don't remove the wreath until I get there. This requires a different approach." While Brennan waited for his supervisor, Torres made his own phone call. Colonel Patricia Hayes answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Colonel Hayes, this is Staff Sergeant Torres. I need to report a situation involving the dignity of military memorials." Torres quickly explained the circumstances, describing Elena Rodriguez's wreath and the Park Service's attempt to remove it. Colonel Hayes listened without interruption, then asked pointed questions about the wreath's placement, the reasoning for its removal, and the current status of the confrontation. As Torres provided details, the colonel's tone shifted from professional inquiry to barely controlled anger. "Sergeant Torres, you are absolutely correct to defend that memorial. A Gold Star mother's tribute to her fallen son is not unauthorized. It's sacred. Stand your ground. I'm making some calls." The colonel's first call was to General Robert Morrison, commanding officer of the Military District of Washington. Her second call was to the office of the Secretary of the Interior. Her third call was to the Park Service's regional director. Each conversation was brief, pointed, and left no doubt about the military's position on the matter. Within minutes of the colonel's calls, Brennan's radio crackled with an urgent message from Park Service headquarters.
All units, be advised, Memorial Wreath at Lincoln Memorial is to remain undisturbed pending review by senior leadership. Do not attempt removal. Repeat, do not attempt removal.
Brennan looked at his radio in confusion, then at Torres, who maintained his position at the base of the ladder with quiet satisfaction.
"Sergeant, did you just call in military brass to override Park Service operations?"
Torres's slight smile was the first emotion he'd shown since the confrontation began.
I called people who understand the value of keeping promises to Gold Star mothers. Apparently they made some calls of their own.
Word of the standoff had spread beyond the immediate area. Social media posts about a tomb guard defending a Gold Star mother's wreath began circulating, drawing people to the Lincoln Memorial from across the D.C. area. By 8:30 a.m., more than 50 people had gathered around the memorial steps, creating an impromptu vigil that transformed the typically quiet morning atmosphere. Among the new arrivals was Elena Rodriguez herself, who had seen the live stream at her hotel and rushed to the memorial in a taxi. At 52, Elena was a small woman with graying black hair and dark eyes that reflected both strength and sorrow. She wore a simple black dress and carried a worn photograph of her son Carlos in his military uniform. Elena approached Torres with tears in her eyes.
"Sergeant Torres, you didn't have to do this. I know how important your career is."
Torres took her hands gently.
Mrs. Rodriguez, Carlos saved my life. The least I can do is protect his memory. This wreath stays where you placed it.
Elena turned to Brennan, who was still standing beside his ladder, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation.
"Sir, I'm Elena Rodriguez. That's my son's memorial wreath. Carlos died 3 months ago in Afghanistan. He was 22 years old."
Brennan removed his Park Service cap and held it respectfully.
"Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. I was just following regulations about memorial displays."
"I understand you have a job to do," Elena said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "But Carlos loved this memorial. He said Lincoln understood what it meant to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. Placing his wreath here wasn't about violating regulations. It was about honoring his memory in a place that meant something to him." The crowd listened in respectful silence as Elena spoke, and several people wiped away tears. A young Marine in dress blues who had been passing by stopped and stood at attention when he heard Elena's words. An elderly woman in a wheelchair moved closer, clutching a small American flag. Brennan found himself facing not just a regulatory decision, but a moment that demanded basic human decency. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I didn't understand the personal significance of the wreath. If I had known, you couldn't have known," Elena said gently. "But now you do, and now you have a choice to make." At exactly 9 a.m., a black sedan with military plates pulled up to the Lincoln Memorial. Colonel Patricia Hayes stepped out, her dress blue uniform immediately commanding attention from the gathered crowd. At 48, Colonel Hayes was a striking figure, tall, composed, with steel gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Hayes approached the scene with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but her first stop was Elena Rodriguez. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm Colonel Hayes from Arlington National Cemetery. I'm here because your son's memorial was threatened, and that's unacceptable." Elena looked up at the colonel with surprise and gratitude. "Colonel, I never expected. I just wanted Carlos to be remembered. Mrs. Rodriguez, your son died serving his country. His memory deserves protection, not bureaucratic interference." Hayes turned to Torres, acknowledging him with a nod. "Sergeant Torres, well done. You upheld the values we swore to defend." Finally, Hayes addressed Brennan, who had climbed down from his ladder and stood at awkward attention. "You are?" "Kevin Brennan, Park Service Maintenance Supervisor," he replied, his voice noticeably less confident than it had been an hour earlier.
Mr. Brennan, let me explain something about military memorials. When a Gold Star mother places a wreath in honor of her fallen son, that's not an unauthorized display, that's a sacred act of remembrance. Attempting to remove it is not just a violation of common decency, it's a dishonor to every service member who has given their life for this country. Brennan's face flushed with embarrassment and growing understanding. "Colonel, I was following Park Service regulations. I didn't realize—" "Mr. Brennan, I'm sure you were following regulations, but regulations serve people, not the other way around. When regulations conflict with basic human dignity and respect for military sacrifice, the regulations need to be reconsidered." Hayes turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the memorial steps. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed here today is the difference between following rules and understanding values." Staff Sergeant Torres stood his ground, not because he wanted to cause problems, but because he understood that some things are more important than convenience or protocol. The crowd responded with spontaneous applause, and several people called out "thank you" and "well done." Torres remained at attention, but his slight nod acknowledged their support. District Manager Janet Williams arrived just as Colonel Hayes finished addressing the crowd. Williams, a pragmatic woman who had navigated numerous political and cultural sensitivities during her Park Service career, immediately recognized that this situation required diplomatic resolution rather than regulatory enforcement. Williams approached Colonel Hayes with professional courtesy. "Colonel, I'm Janet Williams, Park Service District Manager. I understand there's been a misunderstanding about memorial protocols." Hayes's response was measured but firm. "Miss Williams, the misunderstanding was attempting to remove a Gold Star mother's memorial to her fallen son. That's not a protocol issue. That's a values issue." Williams nodded, her expression serious. "Colonel, you're absolutely right. Our regulations are intended to preserve the dignity of national memorials, not to prevent legitimate acts of remembrance. We need to review our policies to ensure they're more sensitive to military families and veterans." She turned to Elena Rodriguez. "Mrs. Rodriguez, on behalf of the Park Service, I apologize for the distress this situation has caused. Your son's memorial wreath will remain in place for as long as you feel is appropriate." Elena's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you. Carlos would have been proud to know that people cared enough to protect his memory." Williams addressed Brennan directly. "Kevin, you were following the procedures as written, but this situation shows us that our procedures need improvement. I want you to work with Arlington National Cemetery to develop better guidelines for handling military memorials on park property." Brennan nodded, visibly relieved to have a constructive path forward. "Yes, ma'am, I'd like to learn more about appropriate ways to honor military sacrifice." Torres stepped forward, extending his hand to Brennan. "Mr. Brennan, I know you were doing your job. The important thing is that we figured out the right thing to do." Brennan shook Torres's hand gratefully. "Sergeant Torres, thank you for helping me understand what this wreath really meant. I won't forget this lesson." Colonel Hayes made an unexpected announcement to the gathered crowd. "Mrs. Rodriguez, if you're willing, I'd like to invite you and Sergeant Torres to Arlington National Cemetery this afternoon. We're going to ensure that your son's sacrifice is permanently recognized in our memorial programs." Elena looked overwhelmed by the offer. "Colonel, I don't know what to say. Carlos would be so honored." "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's we who are honored by your son's service and your sacrifice as a Gold Star mother. The nation owes you a debt we can never fully repay, but we can make sure Carlos's memory is preserved with the dignity it deserves." The crowd erupted in applause, and several people approached Elena to thank her and share their own stories of military service and loss. The Marine in dress blues requested permission to stand honor guard beside the wreath for the remainder of the day, a request that Elena tearfully accepted. Torres stood beside Elena as the crowd gradually dispersed, many people stopping to take photos of the wreath and to thank him for his stand. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, approached with her mother and handed Torres a small American flag. "Thank you for protecting the soldier's memory," she said in a serious voice that reminded Torres powerfully of Carlos's little sister. Torres knelt to the girl's level. "What's your name?" "Sarah. My daddy's in the army. He's deployed right now." Torres took the flag carefully. "Sarah, your daddy is serving our country just like Carlos did. When he comes home, you make sure he knows how proud you are of him." The girl nodded solemnly and hugged Torres before returning to her mother. Torres tucked the small flag into his pocket beside the photograph of Carlos, another reminder of why some promises couldn't be broken. That evening, Torres returned to Arlington National Cemetery for his regular shift at the tomb of the unknown soldier. As he began his precision march, 21 steps, turn, pause, 21 steps, the events of the morning played through his mind. The confrontation with Brennan, Elena's tears of gratitude, Colonel Hayes's support, and the crowd's spontaneous respect for Carlos's memory. Each step of his ceremonial guard reminded Torres of the promise he'd made to Carlos in that dusty Afghan field hospital. "Take care of my mama, Sergeant. Make sure she knows I died proud." Today, he'd kept that promise in a way he'd never expected. The morning's incident had been covered by local news stations and had spread across social media, generating thousands of comments from veterans, military families, and civilians who understood the importance of honoring sacrifice with dignity. The Parks Service announced a comprehensive review of their memorial policies, working directly with Arlington National Cemetery to ensure better sensitivity to military families. Elena Rodriguez returned to San Antonio the following day, but not before visiting Arlington National Cemetery for a private ceremony where Carlos's name was added to a memorial wall honoring recent casualties. She left knowing that her son's sacrifice was recognized and respected by people who understood its value. Brennan volunteered for additional training on military customs and courtesies, working with veteran organizations to better understand the significance of memorial traditions. 6 months later, he was promoted to lead a new Parks Service initiative focused on veteran and military family outreach. Colonel Hayes used the incident as a case study in leadership training, emphasizing the importance of understanding values alongside regulations. "Rules exist to serve our principles," she told her officers. "When they conflict with those principles, we need to re-examine the rules." 1 year later, Torres received an invitation to Elena Rodriguez's home in San Antonio for the first anniversary of Carlos's death. He found Elena surrounded by family and friends, sharing stories and celebrating Carlos's life rather than mourning his loss. Elena showed Torres a photo album she'd created, documenting Carlos's military service, their visit to the Lincoln Memorial, and the events that followed. The final photo showed the memorial wreath in place at Lincoln's feet, protected by the Marine Honor Guard and surrounded by flowers left by strangers who had been moved by the story. Carlos always said that service meant standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Elena told Torres as they looked through the album. "You showed that at the memorial. You kept your promise to him, and you kept faith with every family who has lost someone in service to our country." Torres held the worn photograph of Carlos that he still carried, the same image that had helped convince Brennan to understand the wreath's significance. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Carlos saved my life in Afghanistan. But standing up for his memory at the Lincoln Memorial, that saved something else. It reminded all of us what honor really means." Outside Elena's home, the sun was setting over San Antonio, painting the sky in shades of red, white, and blue. Torres thought about tomorrow's shift at the tomb of the unknown soldier, about the precision steps and sacred duty that marked each day. But he also thought about the lesson learned at the Lincoln Memorial, that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words, principles, and the courage to keep promises made to fallen brothers. The story of the memorial wreath had become part of military tradition, told in leadership classes and veterans gatherings as an example of how individual actions can defend larger principles. It reminded everyone who heard it that honor is not just about following orders or regulations. It's about understanding when those orders and regulations serve higher purposes, and when they need to be challenged in service of deeper truths. Torres returned to Arlington that evening and resumed his watch at the tomb of the unknown soldier. As he marched his precisely measured steps under the stars, he carried with him the knowledge that some promises transcend time. Some duties outlast individual service, and some stands, however small they might seem, help define the character of a nation. In the end, it wasn't about a wreath or regulations or even a confrontation between civilian and military authority. It was about the fundamental question that faces every generation. What values will we defend? What sacrifices will we honor? What promises will we keep? Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had answered those questions with his actions, standing firm for principles that mattered more than convenience or protocol. In doing so, he had honored not just Carlos Rodriguez's memory, but the memory of every service member whose sacrifice deserved dignity, respect, and protection from those who understood its true value. The guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier continues today, just as it has for decades, a reminder that some duties are eternal and some honors are sacred. And somewhere in the records of that sacred duty is the story of one sergeant who understood that keeping promises to fallen brothers sometimes means standing your ground, no matter who asks you to move. So pause today. Think of Torres, of Carlos, of Elena Rodriguez, and of the countless families whose grief and pride intersect at memorials across our nation. Remember that honor is not just in the grand gestures or the headlines, but in the quiet stands taken by individuals who refuse to let dignity be sacrificed for convenience. And if you find yourself at the Lincoln Memorial, look for the place where a Gold Star mother's wreath once stood, protected by a tomb guard who understood that some promises are too important to break. Listen carefully, and you might hear the echo of footsteps, measured, precise, eternal, keeping watch over the memory of those who gave everything in service to ideals larger than themselves.